Hi, welcome to our ProAV Academy series on tech terms, where we sit down with Alister Chapman and chat through some of the technical terms that just come up again and again in this industry. Alister is one of the best people I know at explaining complex technical concepts, so hopefully, just by casually chatting with him each one of these terms through, these videos can just help clear up some of the confusion that might be out there on each of these terms. Today we're talking about gamma curves and how to choose the right one for your project. So gamma is something we've seen talked about more and more over a couple of years, and I think some of that might be something to do with the popularity of log and people struggling with deciding when to use log, when not to use log. But for the people who don't necessarily understand the term gamma straight away, let's just start by going over in basic terms, what do we mean when we say the gamma that you're recording?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. If we go back 5 or 6 years, gamma was never discussed. It was just something that a camera had, but nobody cared.
We used it, we just had one.
But there was only one, exactly. So now we have lots and lots of choices of gamma. So what is it? It's a difficult thing to explain, but let's try and break it down.
Sure.
So if we think about how television works, we have a camera that captures an image and then a television or a monitor that displays it. Now, all of these different cameras made by all of these different manufacturers right from day one have had different sorts of sensors, whether that was a tube sensor or a CCD and now CMOS. And all of those sensors are going to be giving a different output range. So you throw some light at that sensor and a signal comes off that sensor. And then we have our TVs at the other end, or our monitors. And they, again, use different technologies. We used to start with tubes, and then we went to LCD. Now OLED is the latest technology. And if you think about it, we find that you put a voltage into a tube and light comes out. You put a different voltage into a OLED and light comes out. But those voltages are all going to be different. So what we have is we have cameras outputting all sorts of different voltages and signals, and we have TVs and monitors that their display technologies require different signals. So what gamma does, gamma is the thing that standardizes everything and links it all together. So we need to take the output of the camera, convert it into a signal that has a known specification, so that that signal with that known specification, when it gets to the TV, is converted to a given light output. And hopefully, if it's all working well, when a certain amount of light hits the camera, a certain amount of light corresponding to that light that hits the camera comes off the screen of our display device. And by putting the correct gamma in the camera and the correct gamma in the display, we end up with basically what is normally, or what you see with the camera is what we get on the screen system. Now there is more to it than that, because we tend to view a television in subdued lighting, whereas we might be filming in bright sunshine, but we still have to have that bright sunny day that we've filmed look acceptable on a TV or a monitor that's actually relatively got a low output level. If you think about it, on a bright sunny day, the light level is really high and really bright. Whereas your TV, if you've ever taken your TV from your living room outside on a bright sunny day, you can't see the screen because the light output of your TV is nowhere near the same as real world light level. So we also have to do some other manipulation so that when we capture that bright sunny day scene, it looks acceptable coming off a relatively dim screen viewed in your living room in the evening. So there is some adjustment between the capture gamma in the camera and the display gamma in the TV that compensates for that. So the contrast on the screen that you view is actually lower than the contrast that you can capture, but because you view it in a lower light environment, your brain thinks it looks like the outside world on a sunny day. So there's some stuff that goes on. So gamma, another word for gamma, it's actually a term that I really like to use for gamma, is transfer function. Because what it's doing is it's transferring the captured image to the displayed image in a way that makes it viewable and acceptable. And gamma is just actually about contrast. So it's really about how we get the capture contrast from the camera to the displayed contrast on the screen. Now, of course, if we go back 5 or 6 years, you had one gamma, and you captured with that gamma, you showed it on every TV in the world, and it more or less looked the same.
And that's Rec. 709.
And that's Rec. 709. But now things are changing. Now, just to clarify something there, actually, Rec. 709 is not just gamma. So Rec. 709 is color and gamma. Yep. But if we have Rec. 709 gamma in our camera, Rec. 709 gamma in the TV, the idea is the picture looks 1:1. But of course, that's tying us then to the limitations of the TV. So all of our TVs, the majority, Rec. 709 TVs have a limited display range. So you have a limited capture range in the camera, Rec. 709, and then you get that 1:1 viewing scenario. But of course, cameras have got a lot better. So that's why we've seen the development of other gamma curves, such as log, such as hypergamma, such as cinegamma, and all these other gamma curves that allow us to manipulate what we capture in different ways, so that we can then either do stuff with it in post-production in the case of something like log, or if we're using cinegamma or hypergamma, it gives us a bigger capture range, but then transfers it to our viewing gamma in such a way that it's still viewable, although it will look a little bit different to 709. And we can do lots of stuff in cameras, changing the shapes of gamma curves to make the picture look different.
So by manipulating the gamma curves, we mean allocating more information into the shadows or into the highlights? Is that what that means?
Yes, so by changing the shape of the gamma curve, we can manipulate the way the image looks, and there's various ways of doing that. So at the shadow end, at the bottom of the gamma curve, there's a function that you might come across in your camera called black gamma, and that changes the gamma at the lower end of the brightness range, and we can make the shadows darker or brighter by manipulating the black gamma.
Sure.
Then at the other end, at the highlights, there's generally something in most cameras called the knee.
And I think this is much more common. This is the area that people spend a lot more time manipulating, I believe.
So highlights tend to be the thing that gives us our biggest problems when we're shooting, because there isn't much difference in 709. Faces and skin tones tend to be 60–70% of our signal range. And then from 70% to 100%, we've got to fit in everything else, the sky and clouds and all that. It's a very small space. So what we then have is a function called the knee that tends to kick in at around about 90% of our exposure range, which is generally brighter than white. And when we're talking about white, we're not talking about the highlights, we're talking about a white piece of paper, a white card or something like that. So stuff that's brighter than this is our sky and all of that. And that goes into the knee part of the curve. And the knee compresses all of those levels together to fit them into a very small space. And you can change knee slope, knee gain to squeeze a very big brightness range into a small space. But this is what gives video its video look, is when you start doing that, your highlights don't look real anymore. They look like almost a cartoonish mimic of a highlight.
Sure.
So that's where we get this video look very often, and that's when perhaps you might want to use something like a cinegamma or hypergamma, where instead of having a hard knee, they gently roll the highlights off. But even those, struggle with brightness range, and that's where log and raw and things like that really come into their own, because we get rid of those limitations there.
I guess in some ways, gammas like those hypergammas and cinegammas are more like a halfway house in some ways between some of the advantages of log while still within the constraints of a Rec. 709.
Yeah, I mean, they came before we had log in video cameras, so hypergamma was introduced 10 years or so ago by Sony into all of their video cameras as a means to capture a bigger dynamic range. I believe they were actually used in Star Wars Episode 1 when that was shot. We used hypergamma. So it was kind of what can we do with the limitations of the technology of the time to get a bigger dynamic range and
make video look more like film.
Yeah, and used correctly, they are very, very good. And that's the key thing, again, with any gamma, whether it's log, whether it's standard gamma, whether it's hypergamma or cinegamma, is to understand that different gammas also work at their optimum with different exposure ranges.
Yep.
So different brightness levels. So hypergammas and cinegammas generally skin tones 50 to 60%, whereas with a standard gamma skin tone, 60 to 70%. And that actually does make a big difference. It's only a 10% difference, but it affects your roll-off, your highlights, and all of these things. So when you do start using different gammas that aren't 709, it's really important to do your homework to make sure that you know what the correct brightness levels for those gamma curves are to get the very best for them. Because if you take a gamma curve that, as an example, a hypergamma where skin tones are supposed to be 60%, and you try and expose it normally those skin tones at 70, what happens is the skin tones end up in that highlight roll-off area, and they wash out, they don't look anywhere near as nice as they should, and you don't also increase your dynamic range because you're effectively overexposing it. So it's important to understand for each gamma curve that you use what the correct exposure is, how it should be done, what your levels are to get the very best from it.
Thanks for watching, I hope that was helpful. Keep in mind we also do a whole range of ProAV Academy workshops held right here in our UK showroom, where we cover a whole range of topics, from audio to post-production, camera techniques, business tips, lighting tips, and many more. The main aim of these workshops is to help our customers learn and develop their skills. And there's something about face-to-face training which can just never be replaced by videos like this one. So if you're in the UK, please do get a ticket from the link down below and join us for ProAV Academy.